Hey everybody, Mr. Grove here. Today we're going to talk about the phylum Arthropoda. And so the first thing we need to make sure we understand is there are a lot of them. So there's more arthropods in the world than every other phylum of animal in the animal kingdom combined. And we just came off of mollusks, which had over 100,000 species. So there's a lot of arthropods, and they're really successful at what they do because we as big bad humans can't really compete in a lot of ways. So first thing, let's dissect the name arthropod. So we know pod from past means foot, so like cephalopod was head foot, and gastropod was like slime foot for the snails and slugs. And so now we have arthropod, so that's going to be jointed foot. So just like arthritis is a disease of inflammation of the joints, and so arthropod is going to be jointed of foot. And jointed appendages is a huge advantage. Arthropods have coeloms and segmented bodies like the mollusks and annelids first came up with, but having this jointed appendage gives so much mobility, and in the name of the game in the animal kingdom is try and find new food and keep from being food. And so being an arthropod, that jointed appendage gives you that huge advantage. Diversity-wise, they can go from really small up to maybe like 12 feet max would be like some of the biggest crabs, spider crabs out there. But for the most part, arthropods are relatively small. The group is huge, and so like we said, because it's so huge, we have to kind of break it up into something a little bit more than just the usual kingdom phylum class. So we're going to use subphylums. And so there are three subphylums. So there's the subphylum Uniramia, the subphylum Crustacea, and the subphylum Chelicerata. So this would be kind of like in school where we have you're a GHS student and then you're like a freshman or a sophomore as your class. But then we would say a little subclass like underclassmen. So that's kind of a little bit larger group, and that's kind of what the subphylums are like. So the Uniramia and Crustacea, they have jaws, and then Chelicerata, this is going to be like our spiders and scorpions and things, and they do not. So they do not have jaws, they have fangs instead. And so that means they're going to have to liquefy their food, basically. Basic body plan for pretty much all arthropods is going to be head, thorax, and abdomen. And then sometimes that gets kind of combined or modified just a little bit. So like for an insect, we have our head, we have our thorax and abdomen. Head's where the sensory stuff is, the eye, the antenna, the mouth. Thorax is going to be where the legs and the wings, the appendages are connected to, and then the abdomen is going to be where all the kind of body parts, the internal organs would be. In a spider, that head and thorax are fused together. And so then that's what we call the cephalothorax. So cephalothorax, head thorax. In a tick or a mite, all three parts would be fused together. But regardless, that's still the basic body plan, head, thorax, and abdomen for arthropods. Compound eye is another thing that they have. And so we can now start to see things that are a little bit more clear. It's not just light being blocked out like what some of our primitive things like a jellyfish or platyhelminthes could do. Now we're actually starting to make up, and this compound eye is like lots of little eyes, and so therefore the image is going to be really pixelated. It's not clear like what you and I would see, but it is still better than we've had up to this point. And so that compound eye is going to help. We also have an exoskeleton. So up to this point, we've only had hydrostatic skeletons. But now we have an exoskeleton, which is going to give us that hard, crunchy outer covering, and that's going to provide protection. It's going to provide muscle attachment, but probably the biggest, this is relatively watertight, and it's going to prevent water loss. And so now we can live in really dry places that we couldn't before. So, you know, in the desert, you can have arthropods living there. That exoskeleton is composed of chitin. And the one thing about the exoskeleton is it does not grow with the animal. It's kind of like football pads. So as a fifth grade football player grows and gets bigger, he has to get new pads. He can't keep wearing those same old pads. And so in that case, that's what we call molting for the arthropod. And so periodically, whether it's a crab or an insect or a spider, all arthropods will molt, and they will have to shed the old exoskeleton and put the new one on. And this could take anywhere from a few hours or a few days. And there's a risk involved. It'd be like you being that football player and you got to play 6 or 7 plays with no pads on. That could be really risky. So molting the exoskeleton is definitely a major factor and characteristic of arthropods. Respiration, we gotta if we're going to do cool things like arthropods can do, we got to have lots of oxygen. And so this exoskeleton, which is relatively watertight, then has to have openings for the oxygen to get in. And so these are the tracheoles. So the opening itself is called a spiracle, and then the tube as it leads to the inside the arthropod is going to be called a tracheole. And that's kind of cool because now we're using words that like what we have with trachea as part of our respiratory system. So that's the respiratory, and then for the digestive and waste removal, we have this kind of unique thing called a Malpighian tubule. And so the Malpighian tubules are these little finger-like projections that are kind of off of the digestive gut, and so it can collect the cellular waste, salt, water, nitrogenous waste, that sort of thing, and will help put that into the fecal material, and so then it can be expelled that way. And this is a really efficient way of getting rid of waste from the blood and from the cells. So that is some, in general, characteristics of arthropods. So now let's switch over to the class Arachnid specifically. And so this is going to include the spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites. First thing, like we said before, they are part of the subphylum Chelicerata. So they have these mouth parts called chelicerae, and these are going to be the fangs. So they liquefy their food, and they basically suck their food up like they were eating a milkshake. The arachnid body has a cephalothorax, and that's where the walking legs are attached. So in the case of a spider, you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 legs. These 2 front appendages are called the pedipalps, and that's used for kind of like hands would be to handle food. All our arachnids, pretty much, except for maybe the ticks and chiggers and mites, are going to be carnivores, therefore predators, and with no jaws, they have to liquefy their prey. Abdomen is going to be where most of the internal organs are contained. And so 2 in particular are going to be the silk glands and the spinnerets, and then these book lungs here. So the spinnerets are going to help make the silk, and so we got a little video in the attachment that you can look at. And spider silk's a really, really useful thing for them. They can use it in a lot of different ways. Book lungs, and I guess somebody thought it looked like a book here, so like here's the binding, and then these are all the pages. And so these really thin tissue layers then have a high surface area that can really pick up a lot of oxygen and then distribute that to the spider itself. So those are some general arachnid characteristics. 2 specific arachnids that are in Bond County that are poisonous to humans. All spiders will have venom and toxin. It's just some of them are not strong enough to really be a factor for humans. But this one is the brown recluse, and so this one's really common. We've found these at our place before. And so you can always tell a brown recluse by the fiddle-shaped marking on its cephalothorax. And then the other is the black widow. And so the black widow, you can tell because the females have the hourglass, the red hourglass, on its abdomen. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of these guys in Bond County. In my 27 years, I've found 3 of these guys in the wild. And so they do exist, but they are not near as common. So brown recluse, they're really reclusive, so they're going to hang out in that spot in your closet that you don't go to very often. And they really don't want to mess with you, but if you pick those pairs of shoes out this year from last year, then they might have already built a house inside the shoe since you didn't wear them for a year. And that's usually where we have interaction. Most people don't have any reaction to them, but there are some cases where a necrotic lesion starts and the cells die from the toxin, and it forms a really deep pitted scar. And so it can be very serious if the case arises. The other thing on the black widow is they're less common, like we said, in our area. Definitely more common the further south and west you go. But their venom is definitely more. So, I mean, that could be a serious thing if you were to get tangled with a black widow spider. Other arachnids are going to be the scorpions. So we talked before, back with cladograms and phylogenetic trees, that scorpions, they look a lot like crawdads with their pinchers and their slender body. But we put them with arachnids. Now that makes more sense. Scorpions have to liquefy and suck their food, so do arachnids. DNA would definitely be more like each other. And so this is definitely not something we have in our area, really. I think I've had one scorpion that a kid had found in the wild brought into me in 27 years, so not terribly common. But the further west and south you go, you can find scorpions. And the general rule of thumb is the bigger the scorpion, the better. So the bigger they are, the venom's not as bad, and they're a little bit more docile. Another fun fact, as you'll see in one of the attached videos, is scorpions glow in the dark underneath UV blacklight. So a lot of times people will do a little scorpion hunting at nighttime with their blacklight. Another thing is the mites, and so this is going to include chiggers and ticks. And these are the only parasitic, really, arthropods or arachnids. They're going to have one single fused unsegmented body. So it's basically completely all put together. So the head, thorax, and abdomen all fused together. And with ticks, you got to be really careful. Again, like scorpions, the bigger the better. So a big old blue tick on a dog is not usually as damaging as a teeny tiny little deer tick could be, because the deer ticks carry a disease called Lyme disease, the bacteria that has that. And so that can be a real problem. So you want to be careful if you ever get a tick attached to you. I would recommend pulling that off and saving it for a day or two in a Ziploc bag just to make sure nothing is happening infection-wise. And then if that's the case, then you can go ahead and get rid of it. The other thing is chiggers, and so chiggers are very common. Ticks and chiggers live in kind of the same habitat, that long, tall, grassy area. And so chiggers will be parasitic, so the adult chigger, which is not very big, about the size of this compared to a dime, which is not very big. And they will burrow into your skin, and then the larva that gets in there will basically eat on your skin for a few days. So kind of gross. There's lots of old wives' tales, clear fingernail polish to help soothe that itch and get rid of the chigger. I had a student tell me today, wrap it in bacon. I'd never heard that one before, but I guess the next time you get chiggers, you could try. But chiggers and ticks are also going to be part of the arachnid family. So that's the arthropods in general, and then their arachnids specifically, and I hope that was helpful.